I'm going to start with reading a little comment that the chief economic advisor made I think a few days ago regarding the second quarter GDP figures, where we saw that the GDP contracted by 7.5%, and he said that the figure is encouraging and that we should be, quote, cautiously optimistic. I want to know what your reading of the current situation in the Indian economy is, and if we delve into the fine print, is any optimism of any kind warranted or not?
I would say that, in fact, the chief economic advisor has been uncautiously optimistic for a while. It's been a very bad situation for the economy. I think the 7.5% decline that has been indicated is already optimistic. In other words, actually, is likely to have been worse, because this is once again dependent on the formal sector, and we know the formal sector has not done so badly. It's really informal economy which has been massively hit, and that accounts for most of our employment. Okay. Also, the indications are very poor for pretty much all the other important variables that we look at for the economy. Particularly if you're looking at employment, you're looking at consumption, you're looking at sales of a whole range of goods beyond those which the elite can still afford to buy or the middle classes are able to buy. If you're looking at investment, all of these things are down. And what is worse is that the government spending, which should have come in to counteract, that has not gone up. So there's nothing really counteracting the decline. Yes, there will be a rebound. It has to happen when you close an economy completely. Obviously, the minute you allow opening, people will have to survive. They will go out and they will do whatever they can. That is not the same as a rebound, a recovery to earlier levels. And I think we are seeing a massive loss of potential output and potential employment, which will have a generational impact.
You mentioned the government's lack of any kind of counter-cyclical spending. Yeah. And even in this extraordinary situation, this government has stuck to, the fiscal conservatism. I think the old humbug of finance, I think, as Joan Robinson put it. And the same old arguments are trotted out to defend it, as in it will cause, inflation to spiral. The government just doesn't have money, and all these arguments. I know it's like I don't want you to debunk every single argument, but what is your opinion? Are these arguments valid, and how bad is the government's stance on fiscal policy?
So I am afraid I'll have to debunk most of the arguments, actually. Because unfortunately, the idea that the government doesn't have money, it's ridiculous, it's meaningless, and it betrays a complete lack of knowledge of how a modern economy functions. Which is to say that basically in the immediate run, for spending immediately, a government can always spend. It's not that a government has to wait for tax money to come in and then use that money to spend. It never does. It starts spending, and where it requires additional, if you like, these are all book transactions, where it requires additional book transactions, it borrows from the RBI. Over the course of that year, that spending that the government makes, it has an impact on economic activity through the multiplier. It spends some money, people get wages, they go out and spend it. There's more economic activity and therefore more tax revenue. So what is happening today? When you claim that, I won't have money in the future, so I'm going to spend less now, you're making sure you will get less tax revenue, in fact. Okay. So what the government is doing is digging the hole deeper for us to fall into. If you look across the world, governments everywhere have spent quite significantly. Okay, so certainly the advanced economies estimated deficits of anything from 5 to 25% of GDP. That's how much additional spending they put out. The actual deficit will be lower as a share of GDP because the GDP will rise. Okay, yeah. What is going to happen in India? We say, we don't want a deficit more than 4% or whatever, some number of GDP. So we will spend less now because we are getting less tax revenues. When they spend less now, there will be less GDP growth and the tax revenues will also come down. So your fiscal deficit will anyway be large and your GDP will be falling. So the share of the ratio of fiscal deficit to GDP will be even larger. It's a completely counterproductive argument. So that's the first myth, that the government doesn't have money. But then there's the other myth that, well, this is less of a myth, that it can be inflationary. And definitely it's true that wherever you spend more, if there is a supply bottleneck of some kind, it can be inflationary. So this is the big difference between what is called cost push and demand pull inflation.
Yeah.
In India, currently we have cost push inflation because costs are rising. And in many situations, like for agricultural commodities, some agricultural commodities, even when the costs are rising, the prices don't go up because there's no demand. People don't have the money to buy it, so those prices are not rising. But in a bunch of other situations, it's supply constraints that matter. So if you spend more and you also spend money on making sure that you're dealing with those supply bottlenecks, then you don't get the inflation. What we're seeing now, we are seeing specific kinds of inflation, and those are really because of the breakdown of supply chains, which is again something you did. You didn't have to do it that badly, but you did it that way.
Of course. There's also people who say that, that spending money to so that to prop up consumption in the short term, that doesn't have that big of a multiplier effect. So it's wasting money. The old thing of like forcing our grandchildren to pay our debts, and that kind of an argument is also sometimes trotted out.
If you do not prop up consumption of the masses today, you won't have grandchildren. we are talking about a devastation of incomes and livelihoods. And remember, this is 80% of the people, they're already devastated by demonetization.
Yeah.
Then they get this terrible, stupid, and badly implemented goods and services tax, the GST, which is both of which did massive blows on informal activity. They haven't fully recovered from that. We know that already demand was low, investment was low because of all of that. Then you had this pandemic in which we had the most brutal lockdown in the world with only 4 hours notice, which didn't even stop the onset of the disease. In fact, it spread it because it made people concentrate in particular areas, give it to each other, and then go out back to their homes and spread the disease further. We needn't have done it that way, but the point is that is what happened. So we've had a complete devastation of livelihoods. Now, if you don't prop up consumption here, and by the way, propping up consumption is the biggest way to improve multipliers, because if you give money to people who are likely to spend most of it, your multiplier is higher, obviously, right? That's a no-brainer. If you give money to people who will save it, then your multiplier is lower. Right now, I would say it's not even a question of propping up consumption or being nice to the poor and so on. This is compensation. You denied people their livelihoods for a minimum of 3 months, sometimes 6 months. You said you cannot go out and work. You cannot go out and do what you do normally. I forbid you. You have to compensate. I mean, that's natural justice, right? This is not a government being kind and welfare and so on. This is basic competition, basic compensation.
True. So instead of the fiscal response, we got lakhs and lakhs crores worth of credit being pushed through the banks. And the banking sector has obviously not been doing very well for a very long time. And the RBI's report in July, the Financial Stability Report, predicted that the NPAs, gross NPAs of all banks may rise to maybe 12.5% or even 14.7% in the worst case scenario. How badly, because of this fragility in the financial sector, how badly will investment and economic growth will be impacted in the short to medium term? Plus, did the credit push actually exacerbate the problem?
So first of all, investment will not happen without demand and without a market growing. So no matter how much credit you throw at a problem, it's not going to help unless there is demand. That's the basic point. Cool. Having said that, yes, some action on credit was absolutely required because, and this is true everywhere in the world, they've had to do that. Okay? But the way it was designed was actually rather poor. Firstly, it was heavily skewed to larger companies. Even the package for MSMEs went to the top 5% of the MSMEs rather than the people who really need it. And there's a lot of ground reports suggesting that the MSME sector is actually hugely denied credit right now. So again, the bulk of employment, the bulk of livelihoods, and the bulk of the consumption of ordinary people, comes from MSMEs, and they have not been given access to the credit. The second is, what was done was a moratorium rather than a standstill. So let me just explain.
Okay.
A moratorium is when you don't have to pay interest today or this month or for the next 3 months, but all of that interest piles up. So in the fourth month, suddenly you have to pay all of that interest.
Of course. Oh, okay.
Okay. A standstill is where you say, for the next 3 months, I'm not even counting interest. It's like, it's in limbo, it's suspended. And that should have been the correct one, because what have you done to the economy? You've said stand still for the economy, right? The real economy has been told, stop right there, you cannot move. Why should finance keep getting its money? Yeah. So it was done badly. It was a moratorium. And what the moratorium does is push the can down the road and actually make it bigger. So what will happen is that pretty soon the moratorium ends. It was extended, as you know, for another few months. It will end, and then companies and people will be confronted with these huge payments when their incomes have not gone up. When the disease is still rampant, when despite the lifting of restrictions, the economy has not recovered, and people are also still wary of doing the things that they were doing earlier. So suddenly they will be faced with payments that they will not be able to make. So we will see a bigger round of default, bankruptcy, all of these things now coming up very soon. The third thing is that, remember, the banking sector was already in a deep problem, shall I say, is the polite word of putting it. And the bankruptcy code, which is an important thing, it was a good idea to do it, but it really was not implemented properly. It didn't work. It hadn't really resolved a lot of the bad debt problems of the banks. Some of this will have to be written off. It will have to be restructured. And, the longer you delay it, the worse the problem gets, and the bigger your eventual package has to be. It should have been done well before. It wasn't. Then you have a pandemic, you have all of this. The bad loan problem is now huge. It's unpayable. But the government has to recognize that and say, well, now you take a haircut. And we will give you the money for the haircut. Again, governments across the world are doing this, except India.
As we speak, there are probably lakhs of farmers who basically laid siege to Delhi right now.
I'm told there are 2 million at the border.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of people there. And what if we try to give the government the benefit of the doubt? They say that they want to liberate the farmers, and in their perception, they're coming from a place where they see the problem with Indian agriculture as being too much government regulation and intervention, not enough commercialization and involvement of the private sector. So if you anything that reduces the former and increases the latter is sort of liberatory. Does this, it's the typical neoliberal thesis, big government is bad. Does this correspond to reality? And if it doesn't, what are the actual problems that the Indian agriculture is facing?
Yes. So, this whole idea that you have to let the private sector in. Are farmers not private sector? Are they not?
It is biggest private sector. Yeah.
So the notion of private sector, that it has to be Mr. Ambani, Mr. Adani, big corporations, multinationals, these are the only private sector, really, in our economy? That's the first fundamental fallacy. The second is that Indian agriculture has faced a huge range of issues, but I would say the problem is not too much protection or intervention, but either inadequate or badly done government intervention.
Ineffective.
Okay? Ineffective, or even sometimes giving the wrong incentives. Okay. So yes, there's no doubt that a lot of things are wrong. The fertilizer subsidy is encouraging certain kinds of excessive chemical use. You have to rethink that. Encourage more natural pesticides and encourage more natural fertilizers. You have to rethink how you're pricing water. And ensure that you don't have a massive, shift in cropping pattern, which makes you shift to groundwater really low. So there are many things that need to be redesigned in the way that we actually do government intervention in agriculture. But farmers in India are among the least protected in the world. Across the advanced countries and in many developing countries, farmers actually get a whole range of subsidies and protection that our farmers don't get. So the minimum support price, which is now such a bone of contention, it's supposed to be valid for 32 crops. It really functions for 2, wheat and rice, and maybe a little bit sugarcane, sometimes some oilseed. It doesn't function in most of the country. Basically, 4 or 5 states in the country is really only where you get the minimum support price as the base. But where you have it functioning, you realize what a difference it makes. Why are farmers in Haryana and Punjab so upset? Because they know, they've seen what happened in Bihar. APMCs, again, the agricultural produce marketing, they have a lot of problems, okay? No doubt about it. The market yards, there are many, many issues in the way they function. But it's a bit like saying government schools aren't functioning well, let's just close them down. You've got to get rid of everything. And farmers know that where they have the market yards, where they have that government regulation, at least they get the minimum support price for their basic crops. Whereas Bihar, which got rid of it, as you know, in Bihar, farmers are getting well below the minimum. I mean, sometimes even half. And they can see that. They can see this is happening to their neighbors in Bihar. And they don't want to go down that path. So I would say the final thing would be that there is a fundamental breakdown of trust between the farmers and the government. To be fair, Mr. Modi came to power promising a doubling of farm incomes in 5 years. That was in 2014. So farm income should have doubled by 2019. Then the goalpost kept getting shifted. It was going to into the future. Now nobody talks about doubling farmers' income. What they say is, they said we will give you 50% above your total cost. The Swaminathan Commission recommendation. Then they changed the definition of total cost to make it 50% over a much lower cost, which was something farmers were already getting. That was no big deal. So there was nothing, sort of special about such a promise. Then they said, well, we're not going to do anything. It's the corporates who will come and give you much better prices. Of course, they feel betrayed. Of course, there's a lack of trust. And they're right to say, if you are so confident that the corporates will give us higher prices, make that minimum support price a legal minimum. Put your money where your mouth is, basically, is what the farmers are telling the government. Because there is a breakdown of trust, and I would say it's valid, the lack of trust, because they have been denied and betrayed.
True. I think in the early 2000s, you, I think along with Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, you wrote the book called The Market That Failed. Some people might feel that it was maybe a little too early to proclaim that the market had failed. Now, another 20 years has gone by. I just want to ask you, how strong is the case for the failure of the market, the reforms that happened in the 1991 today, 30 years down the line?
So here is the thing. I think where we misjudged is in not seeing that there would be a major investment boom in the 2000s.
The mid-2000s.
That was where we underestimated. However, pretty much all the other predictions, employment, poverty, food insecurity, education, health conditions, all of those other things have been validated. The investment boom, when you look at the 2000s, yes, definitely there was an investment boom, and this is really seen as the success of liberalization. But when you look at it, what was it really? It was a temporary success of a particular top-down corporate-driven strategy, which relied on constantly increasing the incentives to the private corporate sector. Okay, big capital. What kind of incentives? Well, of course, you said, okay, we're going to liberalize labor markets, we're going to get rid of all the regulation, but now we will give you better access to all natural resources. We will, make mining leases easier for you. We'll make deforestation easier for you. We'll allow you to get into all the extractive industries. We will provide you differential and beneficial access to things at much cheaper rates. So, the boom of the 2000s was really something which required what is now being seen as scams and crony capitalism and so on. It required extractive industries. You have to keep giving incentives. And when you're giving incentives, then you can choose the one you're giving the incentive to and get a little on the side, right? So it was not a boom that necessarily relied on liberal markets. It relied on extraction. And subsequently, then we saw that all these scams, there's a coal scam, there's a something scam, there's a spectrum scam. That's also a resource, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Why? Because you are giving all these incentives. So we had an investment boom, no doubt, and we had very high growth rates. Did those high growth rates translate into much better employment? No.
Yeah.
Did it translate into better quality of life for the bottom 50% of the population? No. We got a little bit of increase in health spending, but nothing like even poorer neighbors like Bangladesh were doing. We have terrible health spending and really bad health indicators. We are the worst. Even in South Asia, only Nepal is worse than us in terms of the COVID. So, we really, that particular trajectory, it generated growth for a time. But why does it run out of steam? Because you can't keep giving those incentives. At some point, you come up against bottlenecks. It can be Supreme Court laws, it can be people, it can be, tribals saying you have to stop taking our land. It can be scams and scandals. So that was the growth, which then fizzled out. And why does investment decline? It starts declining from 2012, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why does it decline? Because there is no mass demand. And that's the problem with that earlier boom. It didn't generate enough mass demand. So you don't get economies of scale, you don't get a consistent, stable domestic market, you don't get many advantages that China had of allowing mass demand to increase. Okay. So that had already started. Then when Mr. Modi came to power, the promise was that all this was going to change, right?
Yeah.
Policy paralysis, etc. All of this was going to go. Yeah. What have we got? We've got a worsening of the crony capitalism. I mean, if we thought that was bad in the 2000s, what is happening today is unbelievable. We have one company taking over practically all the Indian airports.
Yeah.
Company that had no experience in airports at all. Yeah. And then why the push for the Farm Bill? Why the need to bring it as an ordinance and then immediately rush it through Parliament without any discussion when it is a state subject? You have to take state governments into consideration because cronies want it. They want to enter agribusiness.
Yeah.
So I think the trajectory is one that cannot work beyond a point, and that we saw. Unfortunately, the present government wants to continue that trajectory in a world where, even the world economy, everything is changing.
Yeah. There's a part of a part of this is that there is basically no alternative in the sense of any sort of economic consensus, that it's basically all the neoliberal economics that rules the roost, especially among the policymaking elites and the media. And if we have to imagine a different kind of development paradigm, I mean, it's a big ask, but what would a different paradigm look like? What would its features be? Because if you have to combat this kind of just ramming through these neoliberal policies with utter contempt for the people.
So, India's behind the curve, as usual, I think, in terms of alternative economic thinking, certainly among the elite, as you mentioned, and our own policymakers. We haven't really caught on to all the major challenges of our time and what you have to do about it. Globally, there's a lot more discussion. Globally, there are many more people and many more governments who are now beginning to look at rethinking the past and saying, I mean, what's the slogan for the UN and everyone? It's build back better. Don't go back to what we had. We have to build a new thing, a better thing, right? What is that new thing? So the big discussion has been around a global Green New Deal. Okay. The New Deal means what? The New Deal is basically taking off from the New Deal that was brought in by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States after the Great Depression. And there were three major elements: recovery based on massive public spending, redistribution, and regulation. Okay, these were the three elements of that New Deal. So the recovery has to be based on very big public spending. The entire US government budget doubles in 3 years. So can you imagine? That's the kind of huge increase in public spending. Redistribution, because you emphasize that people, workers have to get minimum wages, you raise those minimum wages, you ensure that they're implemented, you improve working conditions, social security, all of that kind of thing. Better access to public services, all of redistribution. Regulation, you can't just let finance do what it likes. You can't just let large capitals, destroy the environment and get into more carbon emitting kind of things. You can't, you have to control, you have to regulate. You have to regulate capital markets, labor markets, nature, various activities. These were all three essential elements. Now, all of this has to be global now. Why? Because the world is too interconnected.
Yeah.
And a regulation in one place may just cause capital to flee to another. So you need coordination, cooperation. It's not that you can't do it alone, but it's much more difficult. So you do need global cooperation. And green, because of the threat of climate change. I mean, if we think the pandemic is a problem, this is just starters, right? This is the appetizer course. The main course is upon us. It's coming and it's going to be much, much worse.
Yeah.
So green. Now, I have argued that that's absolutely true, but we don't need just green. We need a multicolored global New Deal, okay? Yeah. Why multicolored? Obviously, it has to be green. Yeah, climate change in India, we are already facing it. We already have climate refugees. True. We have many cities along the coast which are going to be partially submerged. I mean, all kinds of things are already happening. We've destroyed our environment, water, soil, pollution, etc. Yeah. But in fact, it also has to be blue with a real focus on water. I think we know in India how important water is. And water wars are going to start soon. There's desertification in many parts of the country. We know the kinds of fights there are over controls over riverine, the impacts of pollution, you know. So water, green, blue is very important along with green. I've argued that it has to be purple. What does purple mean? Purple is seen as the color of the care economy.
Of course.
Okay, and one thing the pandemic has exposed is how completely we have relied on unpaid and underpaid care, and what that means in terms of the lack of resilience of societies and economies. So, you know, if you don't invest in care, you actually lose out not just in terms of a better quality of life for people, but you lose out because your economy is also going to get destroyed. Yeah. Countries that had very good public health systems have actually come out of this quite fine. Look at New Zealand, look at Vietnam, very few deaths, and you know, reasonably, and they got out of the problem also very quickly. Their economies also got out of the problem much better. So purple it has to be, and it has to be red. Redistribution if you like, but essentially it has to be much, much more egalitarian. So we have to expand public services, but we have to pay for those by taxing the rich. We have, you know, the richest people in the country doubling their assets and income during this pandemic.
True.
Yeah. So tax their wealth at 4%. They won't even notice it. Their wealth has doubled. If you tax 4% of it, they're not going to notice.
Yeah.
You know, a friend of mine, S. Subramaniam, the economist, he did an estimate. If you tax just the 965 richest families in the country at 4%, you get 1% of GDP. That would double our health spending. Yeah. With just 965 families taxing 4% of their wealth, which, as I said, they would not even notice it if it had gone. Of course, they'll put up a fight and they'll shout and scream, but it won't make a material difference.
Definitely.
Tax multinational companies, they're getting away with murder. Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, they don't pay taxes in any country because they shift all their profits to low tax jurisdictions.
True.
We can tax them by saying we're going to tax you our share of your global sales or global employment.
Yeah. Okay.
So there are ways of doing this. It just requires sufficient political will. And unfortunately, in India, it doesn't happen because not enough of the public is demanding these things.
True. Yeah.